Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Module 5, an introduction to web programming. So, in this module, we're going to talk about tables and forms, right? And we're going to discuss on why do we require tables and why do we require forms. So, let's understand why we need tables and forms. So, this course is brought to you by OdinSchool, which is a technology upskilling platform, and we help you continuously to acquire new skills so you stay still and stay ahead. I'm Sumit Vijay Vajpayee. I'm having 14 years of experience in IT training, and I'm a mean, mearn, and full stack technology expert. So let's understand what's the agenda for today. As we talked about, it's going to be table and its associated tags and working with forms. But as a developer, why do we need to learn tables and forms? Now, when we talk about using content to be displayed in HTML, because when we talked about web pages, we talked about HTML. We said HTML is a language used for presentation, and tables would be a choice of showing a structured data, a way in which I can have a basic structure to be shown to the user so that it increases readability. So the tables that I'm going to create with HTML are going to put having the content. Let that be text, let that be images, let that be videos. Any of the content that you're trying to put in, you can put into a table, right? So when we talk about table, it's a structured way of representing our data. Now that data can be any data that you want to represent in a structured manner. Let that be companies with their revenues, countries with population, let's say countries with their capitals, and number of things which can be represented using a table. So any collection that you are having whose attributes are kind of common for all of the columns which you are going to have would be sharing this tabular form, right? Now when you talk about using tables with HTML5, okay, we need to make use of some tags. So before we do that, let's see how do we create a normal table. So let's say if I try to represent a table which is going to be something like this. Now here I can have a table which can have rows and columns. So in HTML, we try to visualize our table in the form of rows and columns, right? Now here, if I talk about row, is this one. So it grows horizontally, right? So from left to the right. And when you talk about columns, so these are rows, right? And these are columns. So here, if I talk about this is a table having two rows and one or two rows and two columns. Now here, the columns that I'm trying to specify, so this is row 1, right? This is row 2 and this is column 1. So this is a table having two rows and one column. Fine. Now if I want to divide or want to represent this data, okay, it can contain any data. It can be as I said, countries with their names, countries with their capitals and things like that. So let's say for example, I want to have some countries to be listed down. So I would write countries and then I would write the country name. Now I may have list of these countries. So I may go back and add some more columns to these, right? So the columns are just going to be one, and I'm going to have one column being getting added for every row, right? So every row is going to have one column getting added, but there every row will not have two columns, but will only have one single column being spanning in, right? So if I want this to be represented, so let's say Australia. So I can go back and make use of such tabular representation, fine, which can contain my rows and columns to represent my data. Now we only talked about rows, okay, which can have one column, but there can be n number of items. So it's not mandatory that this is the only thing which I require. Your table that you try to create with HTML can be increased in columns. That's what columns are increasing, and can increase the rows as well. So here, as we have written, let's say we are talking about again countries which will have their let's say capitals, right? Now these capitals, so let's say for example if I talk about India, have New Delhi, right? If I talk about, let's say, Fiji, we have Suva, right? So here I'm trying to represent a table with 3 rows, because this is also a row, this is a row, and this is a row, and this row is having 2 columns. So this is column 1 and this is column 2. Fine. So that's how we try to represent any tabular information using HTML. But the thing is, yes, I understand what a table is and how does this data going to fit into rows and columns, but how do I represent this with HTML? Now with HTML, what you do is you need to create rows and columns by using some special tags. But before you do that, you also need to make sure that you are making use of a table as a parent tag. So let's understand which of the tags do we require when we try to create HTML tables. So HTML tables allows you web developers to arrange data into rows and columns. Okay, that's what we saw. You can have the serial number, the name, and the age, and then having some data contained inside it, right? So the associated tags that you used with the table tag. So by default, when you want to create a table, okay, you would have a table being created by using a table tag. So here I would go back and have a table tag being created. Now within this table, I can have associative tags which are there. So there are different associative tags. Okay, like you have caption, you have TD, you have TR, and other things. So let's have a look at it. So table and end of table is what is going to be the parent tag, under which I'm going to have the associative or the child elements of a table to represent. So I need to have rows, and every row is going to have columns. Fine. So let's have a look at what are the different tags that we can use with table. So the associated tags which allow you to create rows, columns, and headings are t head, right? Which is basically table header. So your table is divided into 2 parts, the t head and the t body. The t head ideally would have, now it's not always mandatory to have t head and t body, but we will talk about when to use it. Right? It's a good practice if you're trying to make of the t head and t body. Then we have table row, which is tr, that allows us to define a single row. If you want 2 rows, you have to have 2 tr tags being present, and that's how many number of rows will be created for how many number of trs you're going to have in. Now every row can have different columns, and that's what is identified by using a td, right? And then you also have caption, which basically specifies the information about the table, right? So anything that you want to show as an information about the table, let's say this is, so in the previous slide, if we say this is basically some superheroes, so superheroes can go as an uh, caption, right? So that's how you try to represent a table. So let's make use of this table tag with our HTML, right? Now how do you do it? You go into Visual Studio Code. Fine. Now I'm going to create, so we have reached till module 4. I'm going to create a new folder called as module 5, and in this module 5 I'm going to create a new file called as HTML table, right? And in this HTML table, I'm going to go back and have HTML page being getting created, and inside this I'm going to go back and use, now because it's the first time that we are running a table, okay, I would just be specifying, let's say, in a table format. So this is my table that I'm creating, and you can see the end of things to be put up by Visual Studio Code by default. Now in this table, it is you who's going to decide what goes as a part of it. Now we have seen table consists of rows and table consists of columns. Now when table consists of rows and table consists of columns, you have to first define the rows, and that's done by using tr. So tr specifies a single row, but it will not be, so you cannot put any contents directly into tr because that's not what the browser would recognize. So for displaying your content, you at least must have a single column at least, okay, which is basically a td, right? Now this table division, fine, which is going to have your data contained within the table, fine, that's going to be decided by your td tag. Now it can contain text, it can contain images, can contain video tags and all. We'll talk about formatting things or loading structures per table, but this is at least the minimum thing that you require to have it. So let's say, for example, again we are going to talk about countries. So here I'm going to have countries, fine, and countries is something which I'm going to put, and there is going to be another column, and let's say we're going to go back and by their capitals, right? I'm going to have a row which has two columns, countries and capital. Now I want another row, so we are kind of replicating what we have been creating here. So you have countries and you have capitals. Now this is countries and capitals. So the first row is done. Now let's go back to the second row. Second row which has the India and New Delhi as the name. So I have to go back and have another row. As we know, row is created by using a tr, and you have a td that is going to contain the table data, and that's my name of the country that I'm to represent. And I'm going to have the capital. I'm going to have another row is going to have Australia. Now, if I just view this into the browser, now yes, there are many different tags that we're going to talk about, but right now I'm just talking about simple tags like tr and td. We'll talk about how the things are being represented into the browser. Right? That's where I want to come back to t-head and tbody. If I right click and go back to open with live server, right? You see, I just zoom. You see that's your table data. Right? So you can see countries, capitals, India, New Delhi, Australia, and Canberra as the values being, but it's not reflecting same way how we have written it into our whiteboard, right? Now why is that? Because we don't have borders by default. Tables do not have borders by default, right? It's we who need to set the border for the table. It's we who need to set all of the properties so that if you want these things to be items. So let's say maybe I want my countries and capitals to be, let's say, in bold. Now for that I need to make use of th. But before we move on to th, have a look at what does this browser interpret this table as. So if I right click and go to inspect, have a look at the inspect element syntax. Now if I go down, what you see, Chrome is interpreting this as table. Chrome is itself adding tbody, and then it's adding tr, which is having the tds contained inside it, right? It means even if the developer has not written, the current browsers are capable enough to understand, okay, this is going to go into tbody section. Now ideally what we try to do is we try to have two sections of a table. One is a t-head, not mandatory, but that's a best practice to be followed in, right? So t-head, and that's your t-head, that's going to have your tr. So let's say I try to go back and try to put this into my heading. So that's my heading, and this forms the body part of it. So I'm going to cut this around, have tbody, and have the data contained inside a tbody. Now if I just save and come back, you would see nothing has changed in the UI. But yes, if I open up my table, now it has tbody and thead, which I have specifically written so that I understand that table is divided into two parts, which is tbody and thead. Now ideally this thead section that we are mentioning, you can see the thead element represents the block of rows that consist of a column labels like headers for the parent table element. If the thead element has a parent and it is a table, right? So this thead is a child element of a table. That's what it's going to represent. That it's actually containing a header row inside it. Now this header row is going to have some things like I am saying t-head. Now what if I want to have these countries and capitals to be kind of bold in nature? For that I need to go back and specify instead of td th, right? That's your table header. So when I say th, can you see the difference that it made instead of using just the tds? So whenever I'm using th, ideally it is used in the t head section because that's where we want the items to be in bold. Fine. And once I do that, I do have the data being represented into a bold format. Right? Now fonts and all, we'll talk about that when we go to CSS. Right now I'm just keeping the default font that the user agent uses your browser. Now with this t head and t body, I do have some stylings. Now there are some stylings based on to the properties of a table. So if I'm talking about the table, right, I do have a property called as border. If I say the border as 1, you see that's what is the border applicable for a particular table, right? Okay. Now for every of these values, so now we'll come back to other properties which are there for the table. So there are simple properties like cell spacing, cell padding, fine, which the table as an tag has. So here, if I'm talking about the layouting of my table, as you would see, this is my countries and capitals being kind of centrally being represented. So line text is kind of centered. Okay, whereas India and Australia, India is obviously you can see it's on the left hand side. Now you can align these by using some stylings and all. Right now I'm not going to go to stylings because we're going to focus on the table part first. Now, if I want to increase some, so this is kind of to fit in because it's very close to the border and things which is there. If I want to have the distances from the content towards the border of the table, right? I need to use cell padding. Fine. So I'm going to go back and say cell padding as let's say 10. I'm just giving a value so that you can see the difference. Right now 10 pixels are being left from each of these sides. So if you see this is 10 pixels, then you have 10 pixels here as well, and you have 10 pixels on each of these sides being left. Right? So you can increase the things by using what we call as cell padding. Right? So cell padding is a table property which is allowing you to have the distances from the content towards the border. Right? So that it is within the cell. But between cells, if you want the distance to be increased, then you have to go back and say cell spacing. Right? And in the cell spacing, let's say if I say again 10, which is kind of in pixel value, okay, you would see now these items are kind of having the things being intercells being having 10 pixels. So when I talk about cell spacing is between two columns, find the spaces that is there, and cell padding is from the content towards the border. So this is your cell padding, right? And this is your cell spacing. That's how you make use of table properties. So we understood that, okay, this is how the table can be used in, right? And I can go back and make use of these tables to be represented. But what if, let's say, if we talk about using an UI kind of a way where we want to have a table having columns or rows being kind of spawned. Let's say, so the next part that we're talking about is spanning of a column or spanning of a row. Let's say, for example, if we talk about drawing something like this. So maybe there is a table where I am having some information about a company. So let's say I'm going to divide this as, let's say this is company name, fine, and I'm going to have the name of the company being written. So let's say for example IBM. Now I want to have the revenues being shown per quarter, right? So I may say, let's say revenues, right? And then I want to have quarter wise this thing, fine. So now you may choose to have, let's say quarter one, okay, quarter two, quarter three, quarter four, and things like that, right? And for each of these, fine, you may have a different columns being spanned. But let's say we don't take this into consideration, okay, that we don't have, let's say quarter one, quarter two, quarter three, quarter four being written. but let's say we only have the values being rendered. Okay, now I'm doing this so that I keep it simple. So there is going to be 4 columns represented for each of the quarter, and then I would write the figure that every quarter generated. Let's say 20.6 billion and 19.3 billion, and let's say this 5 billion. Now what I'm going to discuss here is, you would see that this column specifically is, now I can see read it twice, two ways. One is this column is actually divided into 4 columns, or sorry, 4 rows, right? That's one way to read it. Or you can say this column is actually spanning 2 rows. Fine. Now 2 rows, why? Because there are 2 rows to be specifically talking about. Now you can even say there are 4 rows, yes. So this column is spanning 4 rows. Now if there is a 5th row, I'll say the column is being spanning 5 rows. Right? That's how you define a row span. Now because it's going to have columns and rows both which can be spawned, so you have 2 properties. One is row span and second is column span. So how do I understand that what is a row span and what is a column span? Now anything that goes on to occupy the number of rows, it's a row span. Now here you will see this column has actually spawned 1, 2, 3 and 4 rows, right? So this is row span, right? So this is your row span. Now we can also have column span, okay, where we would have columns to be spanned rather than the rows. Okay, so it will be growing horizontally and it will be occupying much of a size. So let's say if I say this is kind of a structure that we can create, let's say this is a table and we can have this row being divided into 2 columns. Fine. So here I would have this row to be spawned, fine, of 2 columns. So here I'll say this is called span. So that's how you represent the values of, or the properties of, individual item, which is basically your, so either your th, fine, that you're trying to put it, or maybe t or t that you're trying to put, that will the row span and the call span. So we'll be talking about where do we require this row span and call span. So let's have a look at a very simple example of it. So let me delete all of these items back. Now this table where I'm having some, so let me create another table of it. Go back and have a table, and here I would, let's say, go back and have an column specifying, let's see, head. I'll specify body, and then into this t head I will be providing r, that's my table row, and within it I'll have td, right? Or maybe even sketch for that matter. I'm going to have, let's say, 2 columns here, fine, for representing something. Now if I'm trying to say, let's say instead of having a way that we represent, let's understand the row span first. So what I'll do, maybe in this I'm going to have the name of the company, right? And here have, let's say, it's officers being present. Now here the rows which I'm basically specifying are going to be, okay, let's go back and do it in a way that is being vertical. So I'll be showing you vertical span of this, the actual name of it. So IBM, and what I choose to have is containing my tr have t. So every item here will have the th and the td, because that's your name and value which you are trying to specify. So here I'm going to go back and have this t head, fine, let's say as officer. Now I'm specifically changing the way that we are going to represent, because I want you to understand that we can have this vertical representation or an horizontal representation. Now here, like I'm saying the name as IBM, fine, that's your T head and TD. Now if you want, you don't have to always go back and make use of T head as well, right? You can also use it in T body directly, but that's not the best practice. But if you want to do that, that can still be possible, right? Not a problem. And in the offices, what I want is, I would want the countries in which this is present in. So let's say go back, say India, fine, that's your country. Now if I just have another TR to have a TD present in, and that would just represent the value. If I just have a look at it, you'll see how it's being specifically looking like. Now you see, if I'll just give the border, that you can see how it's spanning. Let's say border as 1, and you see name, right? IBM, offices, India, which is right. But then this third row, find that you had, is just having one single column, which is right, that Australia is being represented. But what I would want is, I want these columns to be kind of spawned in. So here I want offices to occupy these rows, okay, and then Australia to come on the right hand side. Now because I want offices to span 2 rows, I have to go back into th and specify row span equal to 2. And the moment I do that, that's what I get in. You can see offices being spawned 2 rows. This is 1 and this is. So we have chosen not to represent the columns in this format, but we have represented to have the headers in this way, fine, which is in one single column, and then on the right hand side we have chosen to have the information about it. Now I can go back and increment each of these values. So I have to go back and specify, okay, this offices which is going to spawn 2 rows, fine. So a row span is equal to 2 is number of columns offices is going to spawn in, right? So number of rows that it's going to spawn in. The number of rows are India and Australia. So it has taken the value for Australia as well, and because it's spanning these 2 items, Australia is being shifted on the right hand side. Now you obviously need to keep track of how many columns you're having in, because if you just add another column in here, let's say for example if you're reading it in the same row, then that would be out of the context. So let's say here I go back and say Japan. Now here you see this is kind of misaligned, right? So you need to be very sure that if anything that you're row spanning or call spanning in any of that matter, should be taking care that it is in accordance with what you're expecting it to be. You need to keep the balance, fine, for each of the items so that you don't run out of the. So that's row span. On the same lines, you can also have call span, find something which can span the columns, fine, and I would want you to try out a call span. If that's how you could go with the row span that you have done. But if you want the column span, what change would happen? It will just be adding it to columns to be spawned in rather than one single row or one single column is specific rows, right? How you can make use of call span. Now, when I'm trying to make use of call span, let's understand that when I use span, I need to be very sure that which columns that I'm going to apply to. It's again a TD attribute that's going to be there. I'm going to be very sure about which column is it's going to apply. Because if I try to specify any column for any of the values, so let's say for example, I try to go back and use another TR here. If I say this is my another TR, now this TR can have one single column. Now I may go back and have n number of TRs being given because I'm the one who's going to specify some values inside it, right? So here, let's say in this th, I specify something that I'm going to have it to be listed down. Now in this, I may go back and say contact us, right? Now if I only have one tr and th to be left around, you would see that this is spanning only this one single column, right? Okay. Now what if I want this to actually spawn two columns, but the thing that you should understand is there has to be two columns to be spawned in. Right now, if I just say th to have call span as 2, that's what it will do. Right? Now here, this contact us has been spawning two columns, and that's why I've applied call span to this t. I may say contact us, or you may just be going back and giving some links onto it. Say http://www.google.com, or sorry, ibm.com, any of these values. Now if you want this to be even an anchor tag, surely can go back and do it. Let's say this is an anchor tag where I would want this link to be appearing. You may even have an image, you may have n number of things contained inside it, and that's how basically go back and refer something. So I may have ref mention, and you can just go back to the site by using. So you are trying to represent any particular column or a row to spawn those number of columns or rows, then you will apply call span or you will apply row span. So if column wants to occupy the size of two rows, then you will say row span. If column wants to occupy the width of columns, then you need to say call span. That's how you create items in your tables, and HTML allows you to do that. Now, if this location find or the table thing that we are trying to represent can have different properties, like I've talked about border and things like that. It can have columns to be spawned, rows to be spawned. It's not a property of table, but it's property of the td and the th, okay, that we are trying to use them. Then cell padding, cell spacing, these are properties of table. They would not work on tr or th or td. That's how you need to understand that there is a difference between using table properties, and there's a difference making use of the properties of the associated attribute. Give a break statement that we have some space in between these. Now, the next part that we're going to have a look at are forms. Right? So we understood table, how do we represent data in a table. Now we're going to talk about forms. Now, what are forms? Forms are something which allow you to take user input. Right? So if you go to any of the websites, right, they would want you to enter the information. Now, a very simplest example that you work day in day out is your sign in and sign up forms. So when you are signing in, let's say I go back and use sign in. Now when you're signing in, you do have a label to be shown. Let's say, for example, that label is username, and this username is going to have some place where you can enter the data. Fine. So you can go back and enter some username. Then I may have space for a password. So I would go back and have a text box which can be entering some passwords inside it. Right? You can have all these data being put in, and once you're done, then you would want to hit this submit button so that you're actually signing into a website. So this what you're entering is an HTML form. So as I said, much of the things are taken from an real world thing. Okay, so if anyone comes to your company, or if anyone inquires something, you in the office, so you go back and give him a form to fill up his information. Find where did he get information about you, his information, mobile name, okay, where does he live, what course is he's interested in. So all these information is basically what form we do it in the paper. But instead of paper here, we obviously use HTML form to take input from the user, so that when he clicks on this button, maybe I'm interested in storing this information back to the server side. Now, when we work with forms, it basically allows you to have n number of things contained inside it. Now you have form input controls, fine, which are associated with the form as a tag. But even if you don't use form tag, that would still work. But we use form so that we collectively can have access to the data that these individual items are having. right? So what we do is, rather than just having input type equal to text, which is basically what this text box gets generated, input type equal to password, this is how the password box gets generated, and input type equal to button, which actually generates this button tag. What we do is, we try to have this information to be stored within a form tag. So how do we create it? We go back and create it by using a form tag. I'm going to have forms.html. I'm going to have my HTML page be created with the forms. Now here I'm going to have, let's say, h1, and maybe I'm going to say sign in, or maybe sign up for that matter. It can be any of the values. So if you sign in, then that's fine. So in the sign in, what I want user to enter some details, and that's the reason why I can have this thing into a form. So I'll say a form. Fine, I can see by default an action being specified. We'll talk about the properties of it, okay, in a moment. So there is a form tag, and within this form tag, you can have some information to be used in. Now with HTML5, right, with HTML5, you have some properties being added to this form, okay, which we're going to talk about in the next session as well. Right here we're only talking about a normal HTML form without HTML5 features. Okay, yes, we're going to talk about them dedicatedly onto a dedicated session, that is the next section. And in this form right now, what I'm going to put are input controls. Let's say if I'm saying username, right, I want to create a text box. Now how do I do it? I would go back and say input type equal to text. Fine, that's how I do it. Then I would want password. Then I would go back and again use input type equal to text. Now if I set text, you will see that I'm able to see what password I'm able to type in. Now I want a button. I'll say input type equal to button. Right, I'll get rid of these. And if I want the value in the button to be displayed, I will just use the property called as value. That's an attribute which I need to set, so that this is the text which will be shown in the UI. Now I'm not doing any formatting, and by default you will see, even though I've hit a new line, okay, carriage return after username input type equal to text, HTML will not preserve this by default. So if I right click and go back, say open with live server, right, you see username, password and everything coming into one single row, because input type equal to text, or let's say this text whatever you have written, they are not block level elements. Now in last session we have seen what are block level elements. So we said block level elements do not allow to come any other element on the right hand side of it, fine, in the normal control flow. So by default you will not have any styling, or even the browser will not take into consideration that okay, I have to retain the carriage return, because HTML by default neglects spaces. Fine, so any number of spaces that you've given, HTML is just going to neglect that. It doesn't take into consideration. So if I want to do it very specifically, I either need to use some styling, or because you have not worked with styling right now, you're just going to work with simple break tag, the self-contained tag in here, and you can see username and password now coming into different rows. Now, when I'm trying to have this, you could achieve this by using tables as well. You could have this username into one column, text box into another column, password into one column, text box into another column, right? So these can be 3 rows, fine, where you're having 3 rows and 2 columns maybe, fine, and you're having the submit button to be displayed here. If you want, you can also have it into but using table for formatting purposes or for layouting purposes is considered to be a bad practice. Fine. So you should not be, as a developer, you should not be using table for layouting purpose. Okay, that's a bad practice. Fine. So now why it's bad? Now why it's bad? Because your table control is kind of heavy in DOM, because you see with table, when your browser needs to create, table has t head. The browser has to go back and create this t head as a word. Then it has to go back and use tr. Then it has to go back and have td. So to just have some simple thing to be created, it has to go back and create n number of these items for n number of times, right? And that makes what we call as DOM heavy. That makes your page kind of slow. maybe a simple table with 10 rows and 10 columns may not be slowing down your page, but yes, when you show hundreds of records, okay, with your TRs and TDs, let's say thousands of records in there, you have 1,000 rows being shown, and then you have the column being represented, and you have frequent updation like deletion, addition, and things like that. That's kind of bad practice, and that's being deprecated, that you should not be using table for layouting purposes. So please use the semantic tags, please use styling, please use div, p, span for having these container elements to be presented. Now these forms that we are talking about, like input type equal text, let's say if I enter something, if I enter the password as well, right, you can see because I've used input type equal to text, that's what it's going to do, because that's going to show me the data. But if I have input type equal to password, which is an HTML input type again, if I try to enter some value and try to enter some password, that would not be allowing me to see, because that's kind of input type equal to password that's hiding the password from being visible, right? Okay, so this is input type equal to text, this is input type equal to button, and these button that you're talking about, the value submit, right now we are not capable of performing any action, because there are properties like you have form to work with action, with action, form with type. So there are different properties that you can set for a form, okay, that you want to use in. Now here, when I'm using this input type equal to button, fine, and value as submit, I would want my data to be sent back to the server side, right? And that's where the action property would kick in. Fine, so we'll talk about it. How do we submit the things back to the server? If at all you want to do that, then you have to have an action, and in this action, let's say there is some server-side coding, and I'm saying home.php. So when I click onto this button, now here I've used input type equal to button. We'll talk about three differences. There is input type equal to submit as well, right? Now, right now I do not have any PHP files or any server-side thing. So even if I'm clicking onto it, what you will see is, if I try to enter some value and I try to click on submit, you see, cannot refer to home.php because that's not what is present. So it actually went ahead and submitted something to this page, okay, which is your home.php, right? And when it did that, okay, it passes information into some part. So we will talk about how does this form pass the information, right? So that's all what we're going to talk about. But before we do that, let's finish up with the different types of buttons that we're having. Now here, if I would have had input type equal to button, and coming back, if I enter some value and I enter the password, if I click on submit, you would see now the URL is not changing, right? Why? Because this is input type equal to button. Input type equal to button is not capable of submitting the form. So submitting the form ideally means that you are collectively passing the information to an intended action, which input type equal to button cannot. Yes, input type equal to button can handle some client side thing, but it cannot post your page or post your submit your form to the server side. So for that, we always need to have input type equal to submit. When I do this, when I enter something, enter some value, submit, you can see, yes, the model is not found, but you can see that the page is kind of refreshed, right? So the moment I enter, submit, yes, it's being submitted because you have used input type equal to submit. Then there's also another button, which is input type equal to reset. That's a value. And here, that's input type equal to reset. If I right click and say open with live server again, and if I'm entering some value, right, now you may have entered something wrong, you may go back and just reset, right? So all of this is what you get with different input type. So when you talk about using a form have a way of having this information to be represented to the user. So different input types, like input type equal to text, input type equal to password, find that you're using in, or even for that matter, let's say I want to check it by, let's say whether the user wants to remember himself or not. I'll say remember, and here I have input type equal to. Now I can even use checkbox. Now what this checkbox is going to do, it's going to represent whether the user wants to remember or not. Right? Now, if I'm trying to do this checkbox, that's again an input type equal to checkbox. Okay? So you have different input types. You have input type equal to radio, okay, which can basically work on can mutually find either this or that. So let's say, for example, you are using username, but you may even use, let's say for a mobile banking, you're using your phone number for doing that. So rather than username, you may opt for mobile number for signing in, and that's what you can do. So there are different form types which are available, form input types, and these are some standard things like I said checkbox, and there's also a, I want to know what does the user own. I want to give input type equal to radio. If I give input type equal to radio just like this, I'm not going to see any of the values except for the fact that the radio button is going to be there. But I want some text after it. So what I will be wanting is a car, and that's what I'm going to have. And for each of these values, to paste things. I'm going to have type equal to radio for house. Now, what you find is if I give a break statement downstairs. So now, okay, let that be fine, not a problem. So I'm having a car, house, laptop. Now, what do you see? Actually, these must have been working mutually exclusive, right? Because normally we use radio buttons for selecting maybe any one of these, right? So if I want to do that, okay, I may be only selecting one of these. Now, if you want this thing to happen, then you need to give name to any of these items. So here I'm going to say, let's say name, and that name can be any name that you associate with this type equal to radio. So let's say I'll just say owner. I'll copy this, go back, paste, and that's how I can mutually exclusively select any of these items. So now you have a choice of having himself to select each of these items. Then if that's the case, you should be using input type equal to checkbox. So these are things that HTML form can allow you to. So what we saw here is a simple example of using form tag. Fine. So we have talked about action. Now this action is something which can be used for sending some information back to the server side. Fine. That's what the form is basically used for. And in traditional web application, that's what we did. So we submitted the form. We went back to the server side depending on the action name that you have provided, and onto the server it would go back and execute something server side, can take the information what you have got from the client in the request object, and then from the request object insert it into a database, let's say, and if that's and redirect him to, let's say, some page, which is the home page or the landing page that you want to have him. That will be either a success depending on whether you have chosen it or not. Now, one more thing about form, okay, that you should be knowing. Now, this is only about talking about normal HTML forms, but you also have some of HTML5 features. As I've said, we'll be talking about more on the HTML form, okay, as we move. And to use this form, I don't need to have. Now, I'm able to use, if you have a look at it, one of the HTML5 feature which I want to immediately tell you is, if I try to enter some details, find in here, try to click on it, find, and then represent some action. If I click on the submit button, okay, you would see that now if I click on submit button without giving an action, okay, you would see that the form is kind of submitting itself, right, with some of the values in the URL. That's what we specify, that the form is kind of being refreshed. Now that's a new feature of HTML5, right, that you can write a form tag even without writing a property action or even the type of it. So the method that you need to use provide. So here there are two properties. One is method, and second that we already talked about is action. So action talks about the location where you want to submit the form, whereas method talks about HTTP method that how do you want to send this information to the server, right? So if you say get, and if you are submitting the form, the information will be passed in query string. So by default, the method is get, and you would see if I do this, if I enter some fields, right, and if I click on submit, you see this owner is equal to on, because that's the value that is having as a name. That's the reason why it's the information which is being sent in the query string. So in get as a method, you have the information be passed in the query string in the URL. With post as an HTTP verb, HTTP verb basically are understood by the browser. So they're a mechanism of telling the user, okay, this is how I want to send the information, right? So even if I'm saying post now, if I just go back, because we don't have actions, but if I try to enter some information, if I click on something, if I try to click on submit, you see, because there is no action, the page isn't working. But what you see is you don't see any information in the URL, right? You would see the information being passed into what we call as headers. So when we use the HTTP verb, which is get, so the method, if it is get, then you pass the information in the URL, and we call it as query string, right? And if you are using post as an HTTP verb, right? So this is what we call as verbs, HTTP verbs, and post is going to send into what we call as headers, the request headers. Right? Now there are other parts as well. Okay, like you have get, post, put, delete. Fine. So there are a number of different verbs which are available, but these are the two verbs to talk about initially. So if I'm talking about get, I'm actually not interested. Now normally you use get for getting information from the server. That's what you do. But if you're using get and you're using the submit button on a form for doing that, then you will see the information to be going back in the URL. Fine, because I'm not wanting to actually send some information into headers. That's because that's what the post is going to do. So your data is kind of being packed into headers when you're using the HTTP verb as post. So that information will be sent back to the server side, okay, into headers, and you will be able to read the request headers, because when you talk about request as something, you can consider this as just a packet. Fine. So request is basically nothing but a packet as an envelope. Fine. So it has header, it has some information, and it has body. Okay. So that's how with these packets the client and the server interact. When the response comes in, that's also a packet. So it has header. Now this is your response header. Fine. And this is the response body. So this is again a packet which you actually received from the server as a response. So we discussed on having the client and server interacting with each other, fine, and they interact with each other by using this request packet or the response packet, which basically is nothing but an envelope that has header and the body, and in having information about what is actually to be sent or transferred over the wire. So that's how you make use of verbs, which are get and post, in your HTML. Now, if I'm wanting to make use of these things, so let's say if I go back and make use of forms, fine, that's what we saw in. So an HTML form is used to collect user input. The user input is most often sent to a server for processing. And now we didn't had any server side part because we are not on the server side end right now, and that's what we did, that we understood, okay, action is something where the server side URL would go in, and if we are trying to make use of method, that's another property that form has, which can have get or post as two methods being. When we don't use it, by default the method is, and if you don't specify these into a form tag, then that's allowed in HTML5, because that's a newer feature and it allows you to create a form tag without having these. So what we covered today is table and its associated tags. We covered table, t-head, t-body. We covered tr, td, some properties of table. we use cell spacing, cell padding, we order to be specified, then we went ahead and used call span, row span as your TDs or TD or TH as the properties or attributes being used. Then we also work with forms. Forms allow you to collect information from the user and maybe store it somewhere on the server side for your future use. We work with forms, we work with input types, which HTML gives you, and we also work with some HTML form attributes like the method and the action. So that's all today for the session. Hope you liked it, and please do not forget to like and subscribe. Thank you. See you tomorrow for the next session. Thank you.